Howdy. Good evening. It's 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, 15th. Halfway through September already. Hope everything's doing okay out there. Smoke's a little better today. It's cooling down. It's supposed to go into the 70s later, believe it or not. I want to continue on playwriting, like we've been talking about Shakespeare, but now I'm going to go flash forward 400 or 500 years into contemporary times because I want to cover something right now. I don't want to wait till I get into this modern era because things are happening out in the world, and a lot of times with this class, if there's something happening out there, meaning in the culture that's going on out there, whether it's politics or it's the fire, it's the pandemic, I want to try to address it through the humanities and through our history of the humanities. That's how we learn from it. That's how we deal with it. So that's what we're doing today, at least. And so I want to talk about Black theater in America, and did not start in Shakespeare's time. So we got to get into the mid 20th century for sure. That's the last century, folks. We're in the 21st century. If you were born in 2000, you were born in the 21st century. Anything before that is the 20th century. And we had some great, wonderful playwrights during that time. This is a time of strife in the country, civil rights movements, assassinations, some Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Kennedy brothers, and many, many more. Black playwrights I'm going to focus on today, not directors, not actors. Although I do want to dedicate this show. I want to dedicate my show here to one particular actor who died 2 weeks ago, Chadwick Boseman. Maybe you know him from Black Panther. He was only 42 years old. Died of cancer, folks. Yes, you could get cancer young and die, so be careful out there. I guess he was fighting it for the last 3 years. He couldn't fight it any longer. But he had made quite an impact on films. I know I'm talking about theater right now, but I'm going to talk about what's inspired me to focus on this. When an artist dies, it affects all of us. You might not know that. Maybe it doesn't affect you at all. But if your favorite actor dies, let's say you like, as I'll like, I don't know who you like, whoever's the up-and-coming person you like, Lady Gaga in Stars Born remake, or Ryan Reynolds, any of these people, or Johnny Depp. He's been around a long time, but you might have a favorite. And so you follow them because you like their movies. You like what they do. Or they're a writer. You read their books. You like what they do. Same thing with theater, and same thing with movies. You like how they direct movies. And so you always watch their movies. Well, all suddenly they die. That means no more plays, no more movies, no more books, no more anything, no more music. And it leaves it's a loss. It's a major loss. Maybe like me, I'm closer to artists like musicians and directors and playwrights and writers than, because I don't have much of a family life. I have two awesome brothers. Other than that, everybody else is gone. I have no kids. And I do have two spoiled, rotten cats. And so people, these filmmakers and actors and writers are very important to me because I relate to their films. I'm looking at their plays. I'm reading their books, and they're inspiring me to do my best work. And when that voice is suddenly gone, especially if it's young, and this was a young voice, 42, 43, it's tragic. It really is. He had a lot of work ahead of him. Maybe you saw Black Panther. It was a major hit. based on a graphic novel, came out last year. He was also in 42, the Jackie Robinson story. He was also in Thurgood Marshall, the Chief Justice story, and he's in Spike Lee's new movie. I'm I've drawn a blank. It just came out. Five Blood Brothers. I can't think the name of the real title. The guys are set. They go back to Vietnam to find something they lost there, and one of their buddies who died there, who was played by this actor Chadwick, is only shot in what they call flashbacks because he's killed in Vietnam. Anyway, so he was very well thought of. And usually when people die and they say, oh, he's a great guy or she's a great girl, a lot of times it's not true because nobody wants to say anything unkind of the recently departed. But with him, it was actually true. He was looked up to. He was kind to people. He was nice to people. He was an inspiration to generations of younger people below him. And that's what they do. They stand on the shoulders of the next person. He was standing on the shoulders of great black performers like Sidney Poitier or Richard Pryor, Ozzie Davis, and the people who came before him. So many more. I can't name them all. And so, and now who's going to stand on his shoulders? Who's next up? There are guys who are up and coming. And so it's an important cultural connection we have with each other. You watch these movies, and if there's somebody in there you relate to or admire, it's important to have that connection. That's why the movie or the play or the book or the music piece is successful. They make a connection with you. And this guy definitely made a connection. So, and now he's suddenly taken out of the picture right in the middle of some very negative times in our country, in the middle of Black Lives Matter, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of political upheaval in Washington. Now we're in the middle of these fires. It's pretty grim out there. We can't even go into the classroom, folks. And so we need these artists and people to look up to even more. And so his loss is meaningful that way. It's a loss in our community. You didn't know him, but then you really did. I'm not going to talk about movies any more than that today. That's for later on in the semester. But we were talking about plays last week with Shakespeare, and I was going to continue that. But I'm going to go off at least today and talk about contemporary playwrights. When I say that, I mean 20th century. Only one of these playwrights is still alive, Suzan-Lori Parks, and she's still writing. But it started, and it's not easy to be a playwright anyway. You guys even know what a playwright is? It's the person who writes the stage plays, writes the dialogue, makes up the story, creates an environment. And it's not spelled like writer, like player writer. It's spelled playwright. WRIGHT, like a millwright. It's because it was considered a craft, and so they spelled it playwright like it's a craft, and that's how it's always been stayed that way. Now, there hasn't been that many successful black playwrights on Broadway. Absolutely not. So they're succeeding or have succeeded and are succeeding in the periphery of the Great White Way, they call it. That's Broadway, folks. Not a good term, is it? The Great White Way. Think about that. Anyway, but there was one. A couple of them have popped their heads up, and I'm going to talk about them today. A woman, Lorraine Hansberry, wrote a definitive play in the 1950s called Raisin in the Sun. It's about a struggling African American family who want to move out of the tenements and they want to buy a house out in the suburbs where white people live. And guess what, folks? The white people don't want them out there. And so therein lies the conflict. And the family is run by a hardworking, idealistic, angry husband, and he has to deal with his wife, his kids, his grandmother. So it's a family play about this move and what it means to them. And he's got to tamper down his anger if he's going to be able to get along with his white neighbors. And he needs to have his anger and his issues need to be spoken about, embraced, talked about, and hopefully a reasonable resolution that he can live with. And the play was a huge Broadway hit with a black class, folks, and very, very, very rare. And during the 1950s, to give you some context, we're coming out of World War II. We're in the 1950s. It's called the Eisenhower era. Dwight Eisenhower is our president for most of it, not all of it. And he brought a kind of calming effect to everything. People seem to be enjoying their lives. We survived World War II. We're moving out of the suburbs for the first time. The suburbs started building after World War II because we had the money, and veterans could come home and buy a house on the GI Bill for the first time ever. So a ton of veterans came out of the war. My dad was one of those, and bought a house. My dad's house cost $12,000. That means a regular person meaning you don't have to be rich, somebody who has a job can actually afford to buy their own home. All of a sudden, they had a car also. That's when cars became part of our culture, was in the suburbs, because the jobs are usually in the city. The suburbs are outside the city. How are you going to get there? Buy a car. And so the freeway system became massive during the 1950s because we became a car culture. We still are. Now we're trying to dial that down. We're trying to get people back on the bus and trains again. And it's not easy. Or at least to get an electric car, right? So all of a sudden, a person can afford a house, can afford to have a couple kids, and live in kind of a good life out in the suburbs. Fresh air, lawns. Your kids are safe to play in the streets. Well, African American families wanted the same thing. But we're talking about the 1950s, before the Civil Rights Movement, which happened later in the 1960s. They didn't have the same rights. Jim Crow was still effective in a lot of parts of the country. Jim Crow was an antiquated, racist document that didn't give blacks a lot of rights in certain states, a lot of states, mostly the southern states. Yes, folks, Civil War was still going on. Maybe it still is. And so Jim Crow is the Jim Crow era of where certain states, there would be restrooms for black people, restrooms for white people. Restaurants where you could sit on the black section of the restaurant or the white section. You get on the bus, blacks were relegated to sitting in the back. That all started changing when the Civil Rights Movement and Rosa Parks said, I'm sitting in the front. An entire world went upside down when that happened. Talk about that later. But these playwrights were setting the groundwork. They're setting the ground for a revolution that's going to come in the 60s. And Raisin in the Sun was that important, that culturally significant, that culturally vibrant. And Lorraine was a very young woman, only in her 30s, and she was working now in a white world, Broadway, and it was successful. Later on, they made a very successful movie with it, starring Sidney Poitier, playing the angry husband. But Lorraine's life was cut short. She got cancer, died at 34 years old before she could really fulfill her destiny. But if what she has, her legacy is raised in a son, she did all right. Powerful, powerful piece of writing that white audiences embraced. And it made money, folks. And when art makes money, people they consider successful. And it did that. So there's Lorraine. There was during the 1920s, there was writers, black writers working in New York. It was considered what they call the Harlem Renaissance. And one of them was Langston Hughes, who is literally considered sort of the godfather of black writers in America. And he was a playwright. He wrote all sorts of things, essays, and a playwright. And he had some success with writing his plays in 1928, folks, during the roaring 20s of Prohibition. You couldn't drink booze, but you could go to theater. But he was mostly playing to a Harlem audience, which white people didn't go to. If you guys have been in New York, go to Harlem. That's where black people live, the dividing line, 110th Street. You should go visit it. It's wonderful. It's changed now because Harlem now is getting gentrified with white people because it's so expensive to live in New York. They've encroached on everybody's turf, as it will. In New York, Little Italy, Chinatown, wealthy white people have moved in and tore down buildings and made New York City unaffordable for most of the people in the actual world, not just in the U.S. And Harlem is really no different now. Harlem is also responsible for a lot of great art movements. Jazz was one of them. When I talk about music, we'll go into the jazz world. And people like Charlie Parker and John Coltrane and the great Miles Davis were coming out of Harlem. That's where the nightclubs were. The Cotton Club is a famous nightclub where many black artists got their start, jazz. But white people like to go party in Harlem. And so white people were showing up. And when white people show up, that means money's showing up. And then it's safe. It's safe for audiences to show up. And of course, later on, they had the Great Apollo Theater. We'll talk about that later. Everybody from James Brown to Aretha Franklin, it's in Harlem, black theater artists, but white people played there too. But it was mostly for black audiences situated in Harlem. And it's legendary, culturally significant of changing everything there is in the culture. Out of one theater, folks, the Apollo. Anyway, so Langston Hughes was writing in those era in a time of Jim Crow, although Jim Crow really wasn't affecting New York City too badly. But during Jim Crow, just to give you an example, folks, it was still legal to lynch a black person. You could actually murder them and not be prosecuted. It's a holdover from the slave owner days, and it stayed in this country until, in some areas, literally the late 60s, maybe even early 70s, before it was completely abolished. Now it's rearing its ugly head again with the Black Lives Movement. We're seeing a lot of white supremacists showing their true colors. So Jim Crow's rearing its ugly head. We've had a lot of our black citizenry have been killed, and we've had the protests in the streets. I'm sure you followed it. I hope you have. We've had protests here in Reading. They're all over the country, and then they've spilled out into the world. They've had protests in France and Great Britain because racial inequality is everywhere. Sorry to say. And so that's why I want to address this right now, because these protests are still going on. They're still going on in Portland. They're still going on in a lot of major cities. And it scares a lot of people because there's been a lot of vandalism and a lot of lawless behavior, and a lot of people have been shot and imprisoned. And there's a lot of anger out there. And it's important to pay attention to what's going on in the culture. And then when these playwrights are writing, maybe Black Lives Matter movement wasn't happening, but underlying, it was there. And so these plays come out of a skin tone. So Langston Hughes was a powerful voice in the Harlem Renaissance, poet, essayist, playwright. Coming into the 1970s was August Wilson. August Wilson set out for himself to write 10 plays, each covering a decade of the 20th century. So his first plays, 1900 to 1910, 1910 to 1920, etc., etc. So his plays are set during the Depression, during World War II, during the 50s, during the 60s, during the 70s, 80s, 90s, and he did finish the 10-part saga, which took him a lot of years to write, right before he died of cancer. But he got them all done. And one of the most famous ones was called Fences. They made it into a very good film about 2 years ago. Denzel Washington directed it. And it's based on, trying to blank, it's based on August Wilson's play, and it's about a family struggling in Pittsburgh. August Wilson wrote a lot of his plays in that's his hometown, Pittsburgh. Although he didn't live there, he was living in Seattle later on in his life. And it's set in the 50s, the play, and Jim Crow era. And the dad is a hardworking garbage man. That's what black folks did in the early days of their lives in America. They got to take out people's garbage. That's about the only job a lot of black people could get. So, but he does well. He's hardworking. He has his own house, married to a decent woman. He has a kid, though, who wants to become a professional baseball player. And Denzel's not having in it. He wants the kid to go. The only way to get a real job in white America is not that way. And the kid is kind of a baseball star, and he wants to do a tryout. And the conflict of the play is the mother supports him and the father doesn't. So, and it's called Fences. It's a good metaphor for our lives. We always put fences around ourselves. Think about that now. Fences, folks, in the pandemic. We're being fenced in with our face masks, with our 6 feet of separation. We're fencing ourselves in with the invisible metaphorical fence. And so August, that play is powerful. In one of his most famous plays, he did other ones, Jitney and Radio Golf, which is not one of my favorites. And they each got, most of them I think were produced on Broadway. He's the only black writer and recently has been produced on Broadway. The Great White Way, folks. So it's a powerful piece of writing, powerful piece of history and culture, and it's about 2 generations. One holding on to the old generation of blacks have to keep their place. As long as you keep your place, you can have a pretty good life. And about people who don't want to keep their place, then want to bust out and live out in the big world where everybody else lives. And so therein lies the conflict. And then there's during the, I would say her most popular era would be the 90s. Suzan-Lori Parks, African American woman who is very influenced by these other playwrights I've mentioned. And she is writing for movies now, of course, because that's where the real money is. I think Spielberg has hired her for a few things, but she is mostly known as playwright. August Wilson, by the way, won the Pulitzer Prize. I think Suzan-Lori Parker won it too. That's the top prize for drama in this country. Not the Academy Award, folks. Yeah, they win Tonys and stuff. That's that. This is about the artistic endeavor of the writing itself, not the produced play. It's a different category. So Lori Parks, she writes interesting poetic plays like Top Dog, Underdog, which featured a rapper and Abraham Lincoln all in one, played by African American actors, and they're very genre busting, very inventive, very smart, and she has broken out into a white world, and with her plays and her writing, very important. A poet who came up in the 50s and the 60s. His name was Leroy Jones. He changed it. He switched his name, which is kind of popular due. They took their white name, Leroy, and they turned it into a Islamic name. And so he, for the rest of his life, I don't know when he changed his name, in the 70s, Amir Barak, he was mostly a poet. He was the poet laureate of New Jersey, folks. Didn't think New Jersey had one? They did. And what that usually means is they get this honorary title poet laureate, they get a fee, and they read their poetry all around the country, and they're invited to the White House. It's a very prestigious. We have poet laureates here in California. If you're a poet, you can maybe possibly achieve that. It's probably the greatest thing I'm assuming a poet could achieve, because poets don't make a lot of money in this country, but you can have a profound effect. And he did. One of my very first, I'm a director, folks. I direct theater, write plays, direct movies, write movies. And a play I directed actually at Shasta College long before anybody in this room or this virtual room was in the world, about 1972, I believe. I directed my first play here at Shasta College called The Dutchman, written by Leroy Jones, a one-act play that takes place on a subway. A black man is sitting quietly by himself, and a white woman starts sort of a flirtation relationship with him during the play, Lulu. And they get into this conversation. But it's still not hip to have a white woman talking to a black man out in public. And it's a terrifyingly scary play. And after they talk their issues over, she ends up stabbing him to death on the subway. Wow. So it's a brutal play. It got a lot of notice because the anger, people are going, oh, the white people are still angry. Well, yeah, he saw the racism. He was angry. Leroy was angry, as well he should be. But he was very well thought of throughout his life. He lived a long life. Just died in the last couple of years, and well thought of. And that's how he was going to express himself through playwright, the art of playwriting, words on a page, the dialogue, stories, the stories you could tell, and all you need is this. You got a story to tell? There you go, folks. Start up. That's all you need. Tell it. And you all have a story. So that's what I want you guys to look at. I posted some stuff on modules. Besides, I'm going to post this. I posted a couple little documentaries. One's on, it's kind of it's a throwback to, I think this made in the 70s sometime, but it's about Black theater in America. And then I'm going to post a couple other things. Like, go look at them. Maybe we'll start a discussion about it. And maybe on next time I see you on Thursday, it might be one of your assignments to write about one of these playwrights. I haven't decided yet. So please go to YouTube. There's interviews with all these people. There's documentaries on Langston Hughes for sure. Susan Lauren Parks, absolutely. They're all on YouTube. And you'll have to find them yourself. That's the part of the challenge for you. August Wilson's on there. Just put his name on there. You'll see an interview. You'll see excerpts from his plays. Same with Lorraine. It's not as many because we didn't have YouTube in those days. People weren't interviewing, but there is some footage on her. 1960, when she died, about 62 or 3, I think. And there's interviews with Leroy Jones. You'll get to put a face on and a voice to these people I'm talking about today. In fact, when I sign the paper, you'll be writing about one of them. So you're going to have to probably, in your research, watch one of these documentaries anyway. I'll post a bunch of this stuff. I'm going to post some stuff today. So it's lecture, the fall lecture. I think this is lecture 10, possibly. I don't know. I'm losing track. Playwrights. Black lives matter in the theater, and it's changing every minute, and it's important. I hope you go out and read this stuff and support it and get behind it because it's who we are as a culture, and it's who we can be. And maybe we'll come out of these dark times. Hopefully we do. Anyway, on that happy note, I will see you next Thursday, and we'll continue this discussion. Stay safe out there.